from SWOOP here, and today I'm with Oscar Trimboli from Deep Listening. Oscar, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
G'day Sharon, I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, and that's informed by 30 years of a corporate career in the telecommunications and technology sector, working for organisations like Vodafone, PeopleSoft and Microsoft. And a lot of the last part of my career at Microsoft was as a marketing director in Australia, where I spent a lot of time working with leaders setting up new work environments, where they were setting up working environments where they were going to open plan, and they were going to all kinds of working environments where they needed to start to listen to their staff, they needed to start to listen to their suppliers, they needed to start listening to their customers. And one of my favourite stories is a professional services organisation who was moving from everybody had an office who was a partner in the firm, and they had a workshop with me, and the first question I asked them was, so how have you engaged your staff in this conversation? And they said, oh, well, we haven't. And so they set up a very simple questionnaire for the staff of what are their biggest fears when it comes to move to activity-based working, which is what they were moving to. And what shocked them the most was the younger staff, the middle managers were completely fine with it. It's like, bring it on, the quicker the better. And yet it was the partners who were worried about the status symbol of giving up their office. And they had to pause their activity-based workplace rollout because they needed to address that with the partners first. And that's a beautiful example of why listening matters in the workplace. And we have amazing enterprise social networking tools today that are quite prevalent, whether that's Yammer, whether that's Slack, whether that's Workplace, whether that's Teams. The technology is everywhere, but the conversations that create connections are the ones that matter the most. And whether you're doing that face-to-face or across an enterprise social network, there's some really basic things we could all learn when it comes to listening and questioning to create higher engagement in the conversation. Leaders who ask questions, and the SWOOP research shows this, and it also pans out in academic research when it comes to conversational listening, you're going to get between 8 and 10 times more engagement with the person you're leading if you ask them questions, rather than just bragging, high fives and big announcements or selfies of a press conference you might have done as a leader recently.
Yeah, well, that's actually, you've hit the nail on the head there, because we've found in our data that asking a question leads to 150% more replies. So I guess what I want to touch on today, so we know that asking questions certainly leads to more conversation, but I'd like to delve a little bit more into this listening side of it, and you know, how you ask the questions that are actually going to create some impact. And you touched on leadership as well. You know, at the moment we're all in a whole new world. We've been most people are working from home during the coronavirus period. And, you know, we touched on earlier in previous to this conversation about in Australia, we had the bushfire crisis as well. There are times where I think a lot of employees want that connection with their leader. So let's delve into that a little bit more about, well, firstly, the importance of asking questions if you are a leader.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, we're not even conscious of the difference between making statements that we think are questions. We think because we put a question mark at the end of it, it becomes a question. But a lot of leaders fear asking questions, particularly on enterprise social networks, because of the transparency of the question. They fear what people might say about their leadership. They fear what their manager might see when they ask that question. A lot of leaders have been promoted on technical expertise, and they think they need to know the answers to all questions. If we think about systems theory, teaches us that when an ecosystem is under attack from an exponential enemy, the systems that survive have peer-to-peer or distributed network communication in place, not hierarchies. So hierarchies are set to fail. Here's a simple thing. In any nation right now, what happens if the leader of that nation gets sick? In any country, in any company right now, what happens if the leaders get sick? And leaders who always say, hey, if you've got any questions, just ask me, or a CEO might say, just ask your manager. That's setting up a hierarchical pyramid where information is filtered. Enterprise social networks create this amazing peer-to-peer listening that can go on, that says, I can not only listen to my leader, but I can listen to all my peers as well. So the way we can solve problems is faster because we can all listen to each other. Now, we can only listen to each other when we ask questions. And one of the things most of us get trapped in is we don't realize all questions aren't created equally. We've all heard of a series of really simple statements. Always start with why. And Simon Sinek has got a lot to answer for, because although that's true, sometimes the right starting place is start with who. And sometimes the right starting place is start with questions that are about when. And sometimes the right starting place is questions about how and what. So not all questions are created equal. Some questions are loaded with judgment and inference. So a lot of why-based questions aren't as productive on enterprise social networks. The questions that are powerful typically start with these two words, what and how. So leaders who are asking questions on enterprise social networks, think about 80% of your questions being what and how-based questions. The what questions could be something as simple as, what can the leadership team do to make your role easier? They could say, what could the leadership team do to make it easier for you to serve your customers? What could the leadership team do to make your professional development more productive? Some how-based questions is not necessarily how are we doing, but how-based questions prompt things around processes and systems that are broken. So it could be, how could we do this better? Or how does this frustrate you doing your role? So sometimes asking questions that expand on the negative are just as productive as those that expand on the positive. So what are some things we could do to help you do your job better? That's an interesting question, but it will get 10 times less responses than, what are 3 things that are getting in your way right now of doing your job? Your replies will go nuts. You'll get 10 times bigger responses when you go into the negative, because it helps you get to fear, to frustration, to anxiety, and people love to complain. So they'll tell you that faster than what are we doing well. So as leaders who are asking questions on enterprise social networks, listen to the themes that are coming out as well. Your questions, if they're always around specific topics, you're only going to engage the person who's posed that topic question. So if somebody says the purchase order numbering system could be much more improved if it went from alphanumeric to numeric, the obvious question is, how can we help you fix that? Or a better question might be, who else is having challenges with our current systems? And then as leaders, we can deal things at thematic levels and let the leaders and the frontline workers deal with the specifics. As leaders, we want to be listening for themes. We want to be listening for clusters. We want to be listening for context. If we can have our listening on at that level, we can solve more systematic issues for the organization rather than Mary's issue with the procurement system being alphanumeric. So that's a couple of different kinds of questions to think about. Try and ask more what and how-based questions. We've outlined this in the white paper we'll provide for anybody who wants to register for this. And it will explain why biased questions are typically more than 5 to 7 words as well. So neutral questions tend to be shorter, but they also tend to drive bigger engagement as well. Sharon, as a guide, 5 to 7 words are great ways to ask questions as leaders across an organization.
Well, that's going to be a challenge, I think, for some leaders to get into that sort of new mindset, 5 to 7 words to
Mm.
ask questions where they're wanting the responses that they're able to listen to.
Mm.
Oscar, some of the things that popped into my mind as you were talking, we've got some really good examples from the Chief Executive, Shane Elliott from ANZ Bank, which is
Yeah.
one of Australia's big 4 banks. And another great example from Medibank, which was Australia's largest private health insurer. So I might just pop some of those examples up on the screen to see some. I think these were quite good examples of questions. However, I don't think they've stuck to those 5 to 7 words. So,
but I think the important thing with Shane's question and the Medibank questions are they are at a thematic level. So Shane's asking a really good question at level 4 listening, which is listening for what's unsaid, which is probably one of the most critical things enterprise social networks actually percolate up. You know, for a lot of us, what we think we can say in a conversation, I speak at 125 words a minute, but I think at 900 words a minute. So the likelihood the very first thing I say is what I mean, there's only an 11% chance. So Shane asked this great question, what else can our leaders do? Now, that is a beautiful question. Now, yes, he has some context. He's got a little bit more words at the end of it, but basically what he's asking is what else? And as a result, you could see on the screenshots just a whole bunch of amazing engagement around the recycling program there. Again, with the Medibank example, they're asking questions at a very thematic level. How else can leaders bring the values to life inside Medibank? And there was a whole series of others in there as well. I encourage you to have a look at the case study. So there's some really good questions that were asked in a series of questions on the Yammer link there. So I think for leaders, as long as they are open within a context, yeah, 5 to 7, up to 10. But the minute you start to get into 2 to 3 sentences in your question, it's too complex to process for the person who's trying to respond. And what we want to do, how do we help our staff be the most powerful? How do we help our customers? How do we help our suppliers be the most productive that they can be? And if we want to move away from content as leaders and move up to the context, then we solve bigger problems.
exactly, yeah. So that was sort of my next question to you then, is we've looked at asking the right question, but then how do leaders, what do they do with those answers? How do they listen to those questions?
You know, one thing when I talk to
Yes.
staff members and customers a lot, I work with a lot of organizations that do employee engagement surveys. They bring me in to speak to leaders, whether that's a whole group of leaders from different organizations or inside leaders that are really struggling with employee engagement feedback. And the same is true for customer service feedback and customer service research. Hearing is listening to what they're saying, but true listening is taking action. And very few of us actually take the action as leaders. So we get lots of feedback, but people will shut off their engagement very, very quickly if you're not responding about your action plan. So the first thing to do on enterprise social networks as leaders is acknowledge you have read that issue and literally write back and say, I hear what you're saying. We're going to get together as a group to prioritize it, sort it out, and come back to you within a specific time frame. So step 1, acknowledge it. Step 2, give them a time frame in which you're going to come back and communicate with them. Then you have to communicate the action plan, and then you have to implement the action plan. The difference between hearing and listening is actually taking action. And if you do employee engagement surveys, for goodness sake, stop surveying your staff until you implemented what they told you on the last survey. And the same is true for marketers and customer satisfaction surveys. Don't survey your customers again until you've actually implemented what they said last time. So many of us fill in surveys, whether that's hotels, whether that's petrol stations, whether that's supermarkets, but how many of us actually know what happens with that feedback? It's really pointless unless you tell me what you've done with that information. So as the leaders, to show that we're listening. So listening is the willingness to have your mind change, but it's also the willingness to take action on what the staff have said. So number 1, note to the people who've made the comments that you've heard them. Step two, communicate to them the time frame in which you'll come back to them. I don't think anybody expects instant answers. Although you've got a beautiful case study with Australian Catholic universities when one of the staff members mentioned a particular issue around bees and the possibilities that they could have bees on their campuses. And the chief operating officer said, hey, let's have a think about it. And within a very short period of time, there were beehives, stingless beehives on campuses. And I think that's a beautiful case study that the chief operating officer acknowledged straight away, took an action, and then they went and implemented it. And I know, based on your case study, Sharon, that employee felt incredibly heard, listened to, but more importantly, a passionate advocate for their university going forward as well.
And that was actually what I was thinking, listening to you then, is it's great to have all this employee engagement. I think you've probably just summed it up. But what is the benefit for an organisation to have their employees feeling so connected to their leaders?
I think we need to look at the opposite, because most employees aren't going to be like that one we talked about with the beehive at the university. Most employees, you've got to move from some level of disengagement to some level of engagement. And the opposite is true. The cost of not listening is much bigger than you think. So when a staff member feels like they've been heard, they've been acknowledged, and you're acting on what they say, wow, they feel empowered all of a sudden. All of a sudden, what they say matters. All of a sudden, they'll offer more solutions to problems they have encountered in the past. So leaders don't have to solve the problem themselves. People start to speak up, and what you'll notice in your network, and your research shows this up, leaders aren't the only ones who can answer these questions. Employees across the organisation can help each other out, but they only do so if they feel like they're going to be heard when they post that question. So it's not just for the leaders that this is critical. It's critical for staff across the organisation to listen to each other. And what you're doing is not only building a great tribe where we all look up to the leader, but we're building a tribe that's got each other's backs. We've got a tribe that's looking out for each other. We've got a tribe that's anticipating for each other. And that's how humans have sustained themselves for millennia. And right now, this kind of model is succeeding more than a hierarchical leadership model. So today, systems that are built with the leader at the top aren't as adaptive and as flexible. They're not keeping their customers as quickly as possible. They're not keeping great staff as well as those that listen to each other across the network.
Yes, we've found more and more of that talking to customers, and often it's those frontline workers, the ones who are engaging with the customers day in, day out, that have some fabulous ideas. And so with these enterprise social networks, it's a way for them to be able to share those ideas with leadership and actually, I guess, improve the customer service at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes we think about enterprise social networks as only inside the organization. Enterprise social networks with power, with impact. There's an organization called Culture Amp that does employee engagement surveys across the globe. And they have a channel that has 70,000 of their customers helping each other out, not on issues with the software, but issues around employee engagement. Now, a lot of the customers you work with, Sharon, have amazing customers. And how have they thought about unleashing the power of the enterprise social network to include customers in that conversation, in that problem solving, in that co-designing? And that becomes exponential because it unleashes so much power, creativity, and then your customers become advocates, almost sellers for your organization's ideas as well. A lot of the people who are in that Culture Amp community, about 70,000 people on a Slack channel, they're passionate advocates for Culture Amp, but they're passionate advocates for making each other as human resources and leadership and training experts the best they can be so they can engage their employees all around the world.
And I guess during this time where the whole world is facing a crisis, a pandemic with coronavirus, this is really an opportunity for leaders to step up within organisations, like you say, right down to customers feeling like they have been heard during this period. So do you see this as an opportunity for leaders to really make a difference during a difficult time for not only employees but for customers?
Yeah, and I think we need to be careful about capital L leaders versus everybody's a leader right now.
Right.
A lot of leaders are struggling with the pressure right now. It's leaders I talk to right now, ask them a simple question: how are you sleeping? And a lot of
Wow.
them are losing sleep. A lot of them are struggling with their sleep. And the ones that aren't struggling with their sleep are distributing leadership across their teams. So I'm going to talk about leadership from two perspectives. Everybody's a leader, and people who have leadership somewhere on their title. If you're a leader who's got leadership somewhere on your title, right now, you need to be over communicating. You need to be over communicating until your staff say, stop, that's enough. Right now,
Really?
yeah, right now people need to hear from us more than ever. Systems that are flourishing are having daily stand-ups. They're getting questions and answers and solutions to problems within a 24-hour period, and their system is adapting and is being really productive. Do not create information vacuums. If you create an information vacuum at the moment, staff just make up their own stories to fill in the gaps.
And there's a lot of fear there as well, I'm assuming, at this time.
So fear, anxiety, and frustration are the top three emotions that people feel when they're not being communicated with. Now, the very act of communicating, we need to think about from a couple of angles: how to communicate, what modalities to use. So it's not enough just to type into a social network, an email system, send a text message or a WhatsApp group. Some people process information visually. Leaders need to think about the same content delivered three different ways: through text, through video, through audio. People will consume it in completely different ways. One of my clients right now, they've got a radio station from 1 o'clock to 1:15. The format's exactly the same. They've been running it for 3 weeks, and it's brilliant engagement strategy. The capital L leadership team runs it, and they share interviewing one staff member for 15 minutes. 3 simple questions. Send us a photo of your home office. Tell us what's that all about. A really interesting discussion emerged about someone's passion for Mexican art because they had a photo in the background, and it created a connection. Question number 2, what song is going on in your head right now that helps you make sense of what's going on? And then finally, question number 3, which was the whole reason they did it, is what's one thing the leadership team could do in the next 24 hours to make working from home easier for you? And what they commit to: 1 o'clock the next day on the radio station. By the way, Sharon, the person who's interviewed tags someone else in the organization to be interviewed, which creates a beautiful dynamic and a conversation about, so why did you tag Maria in this conversation? What is it you want to know about Maria? And they may or may not know Maria, but again, it creates a connection. So both that's broadcast live from 1 to 1:15 in their time zone, but it's also recorded and shared across the network as well. But the very act of them doing this daily, including the whole organization, and this is a multi-thousand organization, employee organization, they were getting really simple issues like, it would be really great if I had a HDMI cable to connect my monitor. At the moment, I'm bending over into my laptop and my neck's sore. It's like, sure, just go and expense it, was the answer from one of the leaders. But what's happening is staff are percolating up more issues because they realize they're being listened to and actioned.
Wow, that is powerful, isn't it?
Yeah. So the second part of this is I talk about listening across. Leaders need to be deliberate in buddying up 2 or 3 people, ideally 3. Why? Because someone might get sick at the moment. So we want some resilience and redundancy in our systems. Buddy up 3 people that have something in common. They may all be working from home as parents, or they may all be working from home as single, or they may all be working from home in a particular geography that they could self-help each other out with some particular practical on-the-ground issues like help, can somebody help me with getting some supplies from here to there? But what happens is when you're setting up people communicating and listening across the system, people are solving problems themselves faster. They're sharing that with other groups, and issues that typically would have to go up and down they're just being completely short-circuited. Sharon, I was involved with a very early specification for telemedicine in Australia because I used to be part of the Skype for Business group at Microsoft. And that was 14 years ago. And in 6 weeks, because of what's happening right now, the Australian government has fast-tracked telehealth and it's national right now. That's a great example of listening. It's also a great example of not listening for 14 years as well.
Took a pandemic to make the change, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's some excellent tips for us all to take out of those examples. So thank you for sharing. Well, Oscar, we've put together a white paper which will be accessible for everyone to access. So we'll put the links on this video and in the YouTube channel below. And I just want to thank you very much for sharing those insights with you. And I'm sure there's a lot that we can all take away from this about leadership with a capital L and a lowercase l, and asking questions, and almost as importantly, listening to the answers to those questions.
Yeah. Sharon, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Oscar.